Hello everyone, welcome back to another reading of Imperial Retrograde, Chapter 2. So, as a disclaimer, we're just gonna have a lot of Bakugou and Deku. Actually, I don't think there is any on this chapter. Reminder from last time, a little bit of TLDR. Izuku cracked Bakugou's egg and he has a dragon now, but that's extremely bad for Bakugou. So, chapter 2, Towers. I have to mention the author. My name is 152 and it's a great author. I really love their work so much, so check them out in Archive of Our Own. It was like a knife had been taken to Izuku's skull, slicing it clean down the middle. Back in Rodin, butchers chopped off the heads of live chickens in the streets and gave you their flesh, twitching bodies when you paid. Izuku felt like that now, the pain in his head akin to a slice from the butcher's knife. The slightest movement sent splitting pain through his crown, his neck and back. His eyelids were gone, weights, his body cracking and creaking with every stiff movement. He curled his fingers around something cold and smooth. Curiosity drove him to wrinkle his brow and to try to pry open his eyes. The world he opened them was blurred, dark and smudged around the edges. Vibrant blotches of light, greens and blues, spatters of purple dotted his vision. He couldn't make out the shapes or the soft sounds in the distance. Confusion rattled his brain, marred his thoughts. Something bumped against his chin, and a soft mewl echoed in his ear. Eerie, he thought, and lifted his finger as a fraction for a dragon to glide its soft body beneath them. Just doing that was enough to wear him thin. He groaned and knocked his head to the side, just to see smudges of red in his periphery. Something huffed. Large gust of wind smacked him in the face, as satisfying as it was surprising. He cried out in surprise, throat burning, and jerked back fast enough for the world to spin and his brain to knock against his skull. He screamed in pain and slammed his palm to his temple, rubbing out the strain. He fell back onto his soft blanket beneath him and closed his eyes once more. Whatever was out there, he wasn't prepared for. He couldn't face the world when he couldn't see or move without visceral pain. He inhaled deeply through his nostril and felt Eri bump its small head against his cheek. A grunt registered in his left ear and jerked again. His strength was quickly fading. He felt rough fingers make contact with his nape and flinched. But whoever touched him did not withdraw. A full palm cupped his neck now, gently guiding him off the ground. Something touched his lips, smooth and round on the edge. Cool liquid hit his peeling lips and spilled from the corners of his mouth. But the moment the cool water touched the back of his throat, he gulped and gulped until the container was empty and the stranger had guided his head back onto the ground. Boots scuffed on the ground beside his ear and then receded, as the sounds of heavy breathing, swaying trees, and songbirds blurred together as his thoughts fizzled. Izuku slipped into unconsciousness. The second time Izuku woke, the glowing blues, greens, and purples had transitions to muted grays, browns, and towering high above him. He felt cold, and the soft fur tangled between his fingers wasn't near enough to stop the chill climbing up his body. His limbs felt numb, legs stiff and arms heavy. His head pounded at the crown, but at least he could see now. And what he saw was nothing more than stacks of barrels which scaled back the rock walls towards the ceiling carved from dark, jagged stone. He groaned, grabbed his head and dampening his fingers with a thin layer of sweat that glistened near his hairline. He was disoriented, confused. Painfully, he pulled himself up and centered his dizzy vision on his surroundings. He was situated between two barrel racks. There were more barrels on the side walls. Room smelled musty, vaguely of alcohol. It reminded him of the cellars deep below the Sunstone pub or the dungeons in the Imperial Palace, and he dared not visit after one too many trips. A creature squealed at Izuku's feet, and he glanced down to see the opaline dragon he'd hatched. Eri dug its nails into his pant leg and climbed the soiled fabric. It dropped its head on his knee and rubbed gently. Izuku smiled fondly at the creature, lifting his fingers to lightly stroke the top of his head. A slight bump protruded just above his eyes now, and Izuku felt curious about it. He brushed his fingers over the spot, but something in his heart told him to stop. He withdrew and turned his attention back to the room. A cave? He whispered to himself. A pinprick of light in the distance created white spots in his vision. Izuku thought it could be the exit, but it made his eyes water to look at it. He averted his gaze, finding at the right wall a man sitting at a short table with a rickety wooden chairs. He was deformed, lumps and protrusions altering the natural state of his head. He wore furs, no shirt, and medallions around his neck. Izuku didn't know whether to call him out or call out to him or make himself scarce, weary of making himself visible to a possible enemy. Izuku tried to move silently. If he didn't know who the enemy was, it was best to move alone. Head still pounding, he shifted into a crouch, prepared to jolt for the exit. He sucked in a silent, heavy breath and lunged forward, climbing to his feet and sprinting. He made it 3 feet before something yanked on his arm and jerked him back. His eyes whipped down to his wrist, found a rusted cuff and chain. He cursed, but he was silent compared to the scuffing of chair legs on rock. Izuku jerked towards the sounds and found the stranger backing up towards the exit. Izuku had been seen, and he realized what that meant. Dread filled him, the realization he couldn't get away, unseen, turning him nauseous. He tried to call out, bargain for help, but the words came out strangled. His voice was raw, his vocal cords unused for some time. Hey, where am I? What's going on? But the man was gone, his footsteps echoing off the walls. Izuku looked around him again, in panicked motion, and furrowed his brows. He shivered, his teeth grinding against each other as Eri climbed up his body and snuggled itself into the crook of his neck. Time slipped by minute. Izuku wondered where the man had gone, what was happening outside the confines of this strange prison. He wanted to scream, to tear his arm from his chain and run. He heard footsteps before he could act. He pressed himself into the corner of the rock wall, and the left barrel rack made himself small. The closer they came, the more Izuku could make out one set of footfalls echoing much louder than the other, unsure of what was happening and who was there. He could only make them out when they angled to the right to find Izuku in the corner, the deformed man accompanied by a giant. A manic smile crossed his plain features, and his dark hair was cropped close to his head. Even in the soldiers' quarters on the Imperial Palace grounds, Izuku had never seen a man with muscles so large and prominent, decorated with scars and intricate designs and yellow-gray ink that stood out subtly on the tanned flesh of his arms, abs, and pectorals. He only wore pants of coarse fibers and fur linen boots, and a cape with black fur linen lining on his shoulder, situated with a dragon hide strap. He was terrifying. He stomped as close as his large feet would go without stepping on Izuku, and he bent down to study his scared eyes. He clenched his jaw, and when Izuku thought it would all be over, the man broke out with a smile. "Hello." Izuku shifted backwards, his fingers bunching in the furs beneath him as the man lifted his hand and pointed to himself. "I am Inasa." Inasa? Inasa nodded with a jovial smile, one that did not fit the occasion, and reached to his side. Izuku's eyes followed from his movement, saw the glimmer of something protruding from his belt, and he jerked. Noticing the anxiety coursing through Izuku's eyes and quivering lipped, Inasa raised his hand in a steady gesture and revealed a key ring from behind him. He looked down at the loop, found a small bronze key, and grabbed for the chain connecting to Izuku's cuff to the barrel rack. Izuku, having wanted to leave the cave more than anything, now felt safest in the place he knew most. He didn't want to leave, and as Inasa yanked the chain and grabbed Izuku's wrist, he realized he wasn't going to have a choice. Inasa unlatched the cuff, and as it fell away, Izuku grabbed for his wrist and rubbed at the tender flesh. He wondered how long he had been there. "Let's go," Inasa said, rising to his feet and turning towards the entrance, expecting Izuku to do the same. "Business, huh?" Inasa looked back and nodded his head towards the mouth of the cave. "You want to leave?" Izuku perked up, his eyes were going wide. Eri made an excited noise on his shoulder, and then Izuku was steadily rising to his feet. If Inasa was letting him leave, then he wouldn't say no. He needed to find out where he was and make it home. But from the thick accents and exotic clothes, Izuku surmised that home was a very far-off place. Inasa stomped towards the exit, his large feet making the echoes twice as loud as they were before. 2 of Izuku's steps equaled 1 of Inasa's, and Izuku found himself counting them more than watching the cave's entrance come up to them. "Where am I?" Izuku asked, biting his lip. He was afraid to meet the entrance, to see that the world laid outside the small cave. He was nervous to see the landscape that would greet him outside the rock walls. His footfalls shortened, and he held himself back. Izuku wasn't leaving the cave without some sort of knowledge to what would meet him outside. Inasa looked back at him, chest swelling and shoulders squared with pride. He grinned maniacally and grabbed Izuku by the wrist, yanking him into the light. Izuku shut his eyes quickly, the light from outside burning in comparison to the dark of his rocky prison. In his ear, he heard Inasa whisper "Yamaklin," followed by an ear-piercing roar far louder than any beast Izuku had ever heard. He snapped his eyes open wide and stuttered at the sight before him, the wind in his face and the beast soaring past him on the way to the mellow blue sky. There was a wall of somber gray before him, a trench separating him from the landing carved into it. Below, grays turned to black, and Izuku realized he couldn't see the bottom of the divide. Standing on the stone chisel path, he could see the edged paths in the opposite face of the cavern leading to the cave entrances that reminded Izuku of the ant farms he'd played with as a child, linking both great walls together as a legion of bridges from the highest peak of the chasms to far down into the black. They had no platforms. The bridges were only made from firmly woven ropes. Izuku thought walking across it would probably require a balancing act. Izuku found himself gravitating towards, looking up into the sky and the sun that shone down into the chasm, only for the light to be swallowed up by its depths. Izuku peered over the edge, found that he could not see the bottom, and then screamed when a creature soared up from the black. Massive wings of powerful bone and muscle beat at the air as they climbed the altitude, nearly hitting Izuku but knocking him back onto his tailbone. He sucked on his teeth and marveled at the specimen until it turned into a black smudge in the sky, then heard shouting and turned into the path parallel to him on the opposite wall. An old woman with a cane shouted, 2 children holding her by the arms, and a slew of younger ones trailing behind. Each was barefoot, all that hair braided back, and glass beads around their neck, all topless save for the old woman in furs. Izuku looked back at Inasa, who smirked amusedly at him. He stomped forward, grabbed Izuku under the arms, and hoisted him back into his feet. Dazed, Izuku didn't fight when he grabbed him, didn't argue when he started dragging him up jagged rock stairs. Eri mewed in Izuku's ears, telling him to snap out of it, but Izuku's mouth only bobbed. This is... Usa, Izuku hummed. only half paying attention. The higher they climbed, the better he saw the community etched into the sides of the cliffs. The inlet on the other side were dozens of men and women. Children ate off rock-stabbed tables and shouted amongst each other, "Home." Inasa didn't turn back to analyze Izuku's expression. He pressed forward, up the inclined path, until Izuku's calves and thighs burned like they never had before. Sweat bloomed on his forehead, and Izuku looked to the sky for some sort of wind or cloud to stop the increasing heat. Air lying on his nape was not helpful, and as he bent his neck and sighed to the heavens, he noticed the tall grasses poking out from behind the ledge of the opposite rock wall. They were near the top, Izuku thought, then turned to Inasa and saw that the wall on his side continued to reach for the sky. He wondered just what kind of place he was in, though he already knew where he was. "Yamaklein," Inasa said. "Home," he'd also explained. It didn't take an educated lord to understand that there was only one place on the continent called Yamaklein, and only one the barbarians considered home. Izuku was in the Yamak capital, and he was alone. Inasa jerked his hand, and the light turned dim as they passed through the entrance of a nearby cave. Unlike the one he'd woken up in, warm reds and oranges flickered across the walls and bathed in warm. Dragon glass dangled from tall ceilings, casting reflected prism-like light onto the smooth stone floor. Izuku had never seen so much of the glass in one place before, and rare and expensive. Izuku would have marveled at it if his heart hadn't stopped at the sight before him. Nearly a dozen people hovered at the end of the cave, dressed in furs, black and gold weapons, thick, fresh, jagged scars, and haphazard tattoos. 3 men were on each wall, one in the center of the path and 2 on a raised platform at the end. Inasa threw Izuku forward and he fell, his knees burning on impact. He felt pebbles dig into his palms and looked up at the man positioned next to him. A blonde, tall, strong, and with a face Izuku could find in a Rodin dungeons. His scowl was ugly, his eyes murderous. He looked down at Izuku and hissed, "Stay there." He looked familiar. "Kachan Maxikla." The man's mouth snapped shut, but his face was still fixed in a bitter scowl. He turned towards the front, and Izuku followed. He saw the throne first, the femurs, far too large to belong to any human, weaved and fussed together, ribs sticking out from the top of the back. The top and the back in a wicked, disturbed fashion. 2 human skulls fused to the armed rest made the hand grips, and the woman leaning back in the chair seemed unfazed by it and Izuku's reaction. She was blonde like the man standing beside him, but smaller and older. A kyanite crown was woven between the thin braids, and black and brown ore created the jewelry embedded in her ears, the center of her lip, and the necklaces draping an inked chest. The red and black designs replaced fabric, her naked breast clear to him. He turned red, terrified, and unsure he should be seeing a half-naked woman, and jerked his eyes to the dust-ridden ground. A soft laugh. "It's all right," it said, clear as the day to the man who hadn't known half the words uttered to him since waking up in the enemy lands. He followed the voice to the man leaning on the woman's armrest. At once, Izuku felt a kindred connection to the man, looking nothing like the people Izuku had met there. He was bespectacled, lacking the muscle and tattoos that set the Yamakleins apart, and spoke to Izuku in his language, devoid of any accent. "Do you know where you are?" he said, tilting his head to the side. Izuku couldn't focus, the dull pain on his crown making his mind stir. He was more curious about why this man was so clearly like him, but dressed in flimsy fabrics and gold jewels. "Huh?" The woman barked something foreign, grabbed the man by the wrist and squeezed. He smiled down at her and turned back to Izuku. "You are in the presence of King Mitsuki, sealer of the tomb, fearless leader of the Drog folk. What is your name?" Izuku chewed his lip, his face burned, and looked back to the woman with fear in his eyes. Rocks cut deep into the flesh of his knees, and his hands felt sweaty. Air whined, and he knew what it wanted. It was as if it had grabbed his hand firmly and whispered, "Be calm," against his ear. He pressed his lips together and breathed in a silent prayer. Chapped lips parted with trouble, but when he spoke, it exuded pure confidence. Izuku Midoriya, head of botanical and zoological research for Imperial Retrograde. The king leaned forward in her throne and rose high to her feet. Long furs fell around her when she stood, draping her body. One leather boot dropped off the platform, then the next. In all her confidence and unyielding strength, she carved her way into Izuku's space so that she was the only one he saw, the only one he could pay attention to. From the floor, he saw her face steady and rise, fall of her breasts as she breathed, the venom in her eyes. Something black, mangled and crawled up left side, but wet, frothy liquid entered his eyes before he could get a better look. He cried out, wiped his eyes, and pulled away a hand wet with saliva. "You have..." she started, then paused. Izuku couldn't tell if it was from lack of linguistic knowledge or a pause for effect, but the room yielded to her silence, bowed to it. The highest thing in this room was the king's status and power, and the rest were just dwelling in it. "You have no permission to say his name. This name." "Sorry? Don't speak of the enemy, Izuku," the man at the throne says. "Maybe you'll leave if you don't. Now, tell her." Mensonga. Mensonga. The woman's shoulder went rigid and then short. Curt laughter echoed off the cave walls, reverberating and hitting Izuku from every direction. She stomped back up the podium and landed on her throne before gripping her side. "Masaru," she said, and the man turned. Was that his name? Izuku wondered. He needed to know the name of the person he understood. The king spouted nonsense in sounds he couldn't understand. She spat, she slammed her fists and boots, and the man Masaru simply watched and nodded with a smile. How was he not scared? Izuku was. He looked anxiously around the room and the guards with their vicious weapons, and back to Inasa, who smiled kindly at the man to Izuku's left. Izuku looked up at him. The king had called him Kachan. What was his name? Izuku, Masaru said, curtly this time. Izuku snapped his attention to the front, terrified and hopeful at once. Masaru smiled, patronizing at him, and Izuku didn't hate it. Do you have any idea what you've done? No, I'm so confused. I just want to go home. You stole my egg. The man beside Izuku snapped. Izuku looked up at him as his boots came crashing down on Izuku's fingers, and as he screamed out from a pain so vivid, he saw black spots in his vision. The weight from Izuku's shoulder dissipated, and then the man's scream followed his own. Dazed, his hand throbbing like the top of his head, Izuku looked to his left to find Eri with its teeth sunk into his forearm. Eri unhinged them and fell onto the stone, scurrying black up Izuku's side. Izuku watched blood ooze from the wound, and Izuku felt tears prick his eyes. He looked back down at his left hand and lifted the throbbing appendage closer to his face. He couldn't feel the tips of his index and middle fingers, but gagged at the way they curved painfully to the right. Round and swollen around the joints, broken obviously, he gasped in his own tears. What was happening? He felt so cold, so tired and alone. It felt like this world was ending. Mikshan Kachan, the king shouted from her throne, and the man went rigid. Izuku was smart. He picked up language up quickly when studying plants. The one word that had been repeatedly used with this man since appearing was Kachan. Was that his name? It tasted like acid on his tongue. Izuku, Masaru called, and Izuku turned back to him. Izuku, that dragon you hatched was stolen from our home, ripped from our fingers by your spies. I don't have spies, I'm a scholar. Someone dropped it in my bag and I went home, and it was about to hatch, so we know it wasn't you, Masaru assured him, though his tone was anything but reassuring. The king rested her head on her palm and stared lazily at Izuku's tortured face. She enjoyed this. Izuku bet they all enjoyed this. But you still hatched that egg, and that dragon is very important to us. She will decide this war. Izuku's mouth bobbed. He tried to raise his fingers, brush over Eri's spine, but they throbbed and burned, too damaged to reach her on his shoulder. He felt like he had stuck his hand into a fire. He panicked, wondered if he really stole their trump card. Would they kill him for that? I don't know. I didn't know. Yes, you didn't, Masaru nodded, but that doesn't mean you are free of fault. You say you know zoology? Well, who do animals typically perceive to be their mother? Izuku gulped, his face turning whiter than the porcelain plates of the Todoroki family ate off of. He felt drops of sweat caking his soiled, muddy clothes and to his body and bowed his head to the floor. The first living creature they see after birth. She sees you as her mother, Izuku. When she grows, when her scales form and her wings are strong, she will not let any of us ride her. She will only permit one. She will only permit you. And the king snapped, her voice harsh and quiet. There was a quiver at the end, like she was struggling to keep her cool. I will not let it pass. It was the clearest sentence that the king had put together. The accent just barely there, and the emotion raw in every word. She slammed her fist of a skull's crown, and footfalls appeared from both sides. Izuku whipped his head to the right, to the left, seeing two soldiers grab him. The left unsteadied a knife, black and jagged in the blade, a hilt of bone, while the other grabbed Izuku by the wrist and yanked him to his feet. The force was powerful, his joints popping. Izuku shut his eyes and permitted silent tears to fall as the blade poked the soft skin of his neck. A small, insignificant whimper passed his lips, too scared to cry out and startled the enemy into carrying his death out faster. Suddenly his ears started to ache, a screech so loud it sounded like the world was on fire. The sound consumed him, made him scream to a chorus of others, and snapped his eyes open to pinpoint the sound from his shoulder. Eri in the crook of his neck screamed louder than he'd ever heard an animal cry, and her body flicked with the blue flames. The lights of the room turned white and cold, the refracted light from the dragon glass vibrating to the floor. Izuku whipped his head in the direction the scream was intended and held down the bile in his stomach as he watched the man wielding his murder weapon begin to crumble. The blade hit his arms, his whole body shriveled and disintegrated into ash. What didn't go turned to bits, to flesh smeared against the cave floor. Before that, too, turned to dust. The pounding of Izuku's heart didn't match the pounding of his ears or his head, but the fear he experiences was still far too real. Eri nuzzled against his cheek. Safe, she seemed to tell him, as the second soldier released him. Izuku's knees buckled and he fell back to the floor. Silence consumed him. In the aftermath, he looked down at his hands, pressed his palms on the rock and tried to find the dust of the man his baby dragon had killed. How had it even happened? How was it even possible? Mikshan, the queen hissed from her throne. Izuku's eyes gravitated to her, found the way she drummed her fingers against her cheek in a bored manner repulsive. She turned to Masaru, hummed, and began to speak in words Izuku had no strength to try to understand. He looked back down on the floor until he heard a furious cry from the blonde man Kachan, who seemed unconcerned with the man who had died horrendously in front of him. Izuku, Masaru called sternly from the platform. Izuku didn't want to look, didn't want to risk death again. The first attempt had been delayed, but Izuku feared that would happen if he tested fate again. Izuku, she will not let you die. We simply tested it. Izuku's eyes blew wide and he whipped his head to the pair standing above him. Fury dug deep into his gut and his mind and heart raged. He curled his fingers of his good hand into a fist and rose to his feet. You let that man die to test a fucking theory. The king snorted like the question was funny, and Masaru smiled fondly at her. You seem to care a lot about your enemy, Izuku, Masaru addressed him. I suppose that will not make it easier for us. Make what easier? Squeezing his hand. Fingernails dug into Izuku's palms to form blood crests. He watched the king and her right-hand man watch him like he was a pawn. He wanted to scream. Masaru cut before he could do it. So long as the dragon will only allow you as a rider, you will stay here, you will live here, train here, and when the time comes, you will be our final weapon, our end all. And if I refuse? You're not allowed to refuse. King Mitsuki rose from her seat, her hand clutching her side still. She extended her free hand to Masaru and began her descent. As she approached Izuku on his feet, he saw that they were the same height, though she had muscle far more toned than he ever had. And while Izuku's expression always bore an undercurrent of kindness, she looked at him as if he were filled. My son trains you. She nodded. Kachan and brushed past Izuku. Soldiers followed the monarch out the cave as Izuku turned his gaze to the woman's son, analyzed the squeeze of his jaw, the white knuckles on a tanned body, and an expression of bloodlust. Scars ran up down his back, arms, and chest, and breaking the tattoo patterns to create their own uglier ones. A proper barbarian. He shifted and Izuku recognized a glint of a gold sword, handle peeking out of a scabbard. The memories rushed back and suddenly he knew who this man was and what he's done. Izuku escaped death once today, but he knew the foolishness in risking it a second time. Still he pursued. You, he hissed, at his first exaggerated but then furious. You're the one who kidnapped me. He got close to his face, saw the way the barbarian shook, and jerked away from Izuku's prying eyes. He turned, took one booted step towards the exit, and Izuku's fury boiled over. Hey, I'm talking to you, Kachan. Hands grabbed his collar before he knew what had happened, and then he couldn't keep his feet steady. He saw the hand grabbed his thick wrist and tried to pry it off his body, but Kachan gripped him so firmly it would be only removed with the slash of a blade. Izuku fumbled with his feet, trying to stay planted firmly into the ground, as Kachan dragged him towards the exit, from the warmth of the dim cave to the sun-bleached terrain. Izuku's eyes squeezed shut when they exited, burning from the light change. He heard Inasa shout from behind, but couldn't tell what was said. Hands were around his upper arms now, squeezing them so tightly that nails cut through the fabric and digged into his arms. Izuku's feet couldn't find ground, and he snapped his eyes open to see that the barbarian was swinging him in the air like he was nothing, a sack of grain almost. He adjusted to what was happening, racked his brain just in time to see Kachan raise his body over the edge of the cliff, just far enough that Izuku could not lurch himself back into the stone bath. His feet waded through the air. He felt bile rise in his throat. The tears began to burn his eyes. He wanted to scream, but he didn't want to anger the man anymore. Didn't want to make him take more offense and really end it. Eri screeched weakly. She lunged, biting into Kachan's hand, but Kachan refused to budge this time. Fiery red eyes fixed themselves on Izuku, and he sneered. Sharp cannons peeked out of his smile, and Izuku remembered the feral dogs he'd studied in the woods. Dogs bite, and they refuse to unhinge their jaw until they know the prey had been handled. Thus, Izuku kept his whimpering silent. My name is Katsuki, he seethed, his accent hardly there. His grip on Izuku tightened, and Izuku bit his lip hard enough to draw blood. not fucking Kachan. And if you fucking speak like that to me, I'm ready for you. I will push you off this cliff so fast your body breaks apart on impact and you can start Vidashi early. I will feed you to my dragon and use your thick skull as a cup for my ale. Do you fucking understand, Mikshandeku? Izuku had never nodded so fast, had never been so submissive to a threat, but he wanted to go home and he couldn't do that with his innards split apart at the bottom of the Yamaklin trench. He wanted to see his friends, his family and his workshop. If he had to play nice just for now, so that he could make it another day, another step closer to home, he'd surrender happily. And the fear in his eyes seemed decent enough to treat for Katsuki, because his vision smirk thickened and he tossed Izuku back onto the path, his cheek hitting the landing. He braced his broken hand against his chest in an attempt to save it from further damage, but all he did was continue to throb. Boots appeared in his vision. He looked up at his attacker. You stole my dragon, Deku. I'll train you now, but you will pay for crossing me. Do you understand? Izuku watched the glass beads dangling from around Katsuki's neck. They glittered in the light, so pretty and so much nicer than the man they decorated. Izuku gulped down his pain and nodded. Katsuki humped in recognition of Izuku's submission and turned onto his heel, leaving Izuku curled into a fetal position on the cold stone floor. Inasa, tsure pak usa. Izuku watched him leave, watched Inasa hustle forth to grab Izuku around the middle and gently help him to his feet. His body shook, ached, and Izuku somewhat wished Katsuki had released him over at the side of the cliff. Being in Yamaklin was a good death sentence as any, and Katsuki would have been faster. He wanted out. Part of him thought it would be better to throw himself off the cliff and end it. Eri mewed into his ear, sad and begging. He knew what she wanted, what she didn't want. He brushed his healthy finger against her head. He tried a little longer. Very beautiful, guys. Oh my god. That was long, as per usual though. We'll be seeing you next chapters, but this was such a good read.